Hello, everyone. Can you hear me okay? Okay, great. Well, welcome to the CJS 2022 Fall Noon Lecture Series and our first lecture of December. So first, I want to take a moment to introduce myself. My name is Karen Yoshida Weldon, and I'm a graduate student here pursuing a Master's of Arts through the Center for Japanese Studies, as well as a Master's of Science through the School for Environment and Sustainability. Before I welcome our guest lecturer today, Professor Timothy George, I'd like to share a few general announcements. So first of all, I would like to invite you to our last noon lecture series of the semester entitled Negotiating the Cold War, Yamaguchi Yoshiko in Sacramento, 1950. This will be a lecture by Michael Bordash, Robert S. Ingersoll Professor of East Asian Languages and Cultures at the University of Chicago. This lecture will be held next Thursday, December 8th. So please join us again here or on Zoom for that event. In addition, I'd like to share that this evening will be the fourth entry in Diamonds by the Decade, the best of the CJS 75th Anniversary Film Series, a screening of the 1960s film Death by Hanging, directed by Nagisa Ooshima. It will be shown at the State Theater, Theater 1 at 7:15 tonight. More information and tickets are available through the Michigan Theater. For our event today, we are both on Zoom and in person here. And for those of you who will be joining the webinar, webcams and microphones have been muted. But we invite you to use the Q&A function during the lecture to submit any questions that you might have. And we'll try to address those at the end of the lecture. The live transcription or closed caption has been enabled on the webinar, but if you'd rather not use it, feel free to go to the bottom right-hand corner and you can disable it there. And finally, please check out the CJS events page to keep updated on our schedule for the noon lectures for the 2023 winter semester. So now I'd like to move on to introduce and welcome our guest lecturer, Timothy George, Professor Emeritus at the University of Rhode Island's Department of History. Professor George received his PhD in history from Harvard University, and he also holds degrees from Stanford University and the University of Hawaii. His research focuses primarily on Japan's post-war period, and his work examines environmental history, local history, as well as citizen and corporate and state relations. Throughout his life and his career, he spent 17 years in Japan, including taking 2 Fulbrights to the country, the first to study mercury poisoning in Minamata, which we'll hear a lot more about shortly, as well as to examine responses to arsenic pollution in Toroku. Professor George has edited several Japanese history collections, including Japanese Constitutional Revision and Civic Activism, which was published last year. He has also written numerous articles and chapters, including Furusato Zukuri, Saving Hometowns by Reinventing Them, and Beyond the Bubble, Beyond Fukushima, Reconsidering the History of Postwar Japan. Professor George is probably best known for his 2001 book entitled Minamata, Pollution in the Struggle for Democracy in Postwar Japan. I have a couple copies that I'll share and with you all and pass around at the end of the presentation today. So this book is actually my first introduction to Professor George's work and some of the scholarship that he has done. During my first semester of graduate school and my first ever class in Japanese studies, I was researching contemporary environmental organizing. As I slowly navigated my way through the literature, I began to notice that almost every single article and book on environmentalism in Japan cited Professor George's work. The next semester, I proceeded to get a copy to see what all this fuss was about. Needless to say, I found Professor George's research thorough, insightful, and deeply compelling. So I'm absolutely thrilled to be able to invite Professor Timothy George to the University of Michigan and now to the stage to share some of this work with you all today.
Thanks, Karen, for that kind introduction. And thanks to the Center for Japanese Studies for inviting me, and to Barbara Kinzer for making all the arrangements. I'm impressed that you brought 2 speakers all the way from Hawaii this fall. 5 weeks ago, Aya Kimura made you all hungry, describing tsukemono and the good microbes that give us delicious fermented foods. Today, describing the effects of mercury-contaminated fish I'm afraid I may make you lose your appetite or at least not want sushi for lunch. I think I'm having pizza today. One challenge I always give students is to answer the so what question. Why should we care about this historical issue or event? What does it illuminate that is important to understand, that offers a particularly worthwhile insight into modern Japan? And for any particular topic, there are multiple ways to answer the so what question. In my book, I used Minamata as a lens on post-war democracy, and much of that will come out in my story today. But today I'll add another point as well, that Minamata is a lens on ways that the Transwar period from the 1930s to the 1950s left legacies that persisted, like other Transwar legacies, despite efforts by politicians, corporations, and others to erase them through the high growth period, the bubble era, and beyond, up to the present. And to do this, I'll first briefly explain how the Minamata tragedy was a legacy of the Transwar period, not really the post-war. And the rest of the talk will trace the four so-called solutions. And in closing, consider why Minamata has contributed to post-war democracy, but also why it has not, cannot, and should not be made to go away. Patients, supporters, the environment, and the disease itself have not allowed Minamata to go away or be over. Instead, it has joined issues such as war apologies, the comfort women sex slaves, atomic bomb victims, and territorial disputes as a persistent legacy of the Transwar period. And there's long been a push to recognize the importance of the period straddling 1945. Way back in grad school, whenever I began talking of turning points or worse, breaks in history, my advisor, Al Craig, would stop me and say, history is seamless. Jessie Abel makes this point in her new book, Dream Super Express, A Cultural History of the World's First Bullet Train. But perhaps the most groundbreaking work was John Dower's 1990 essay, The Useful War, in which he wrote, the notion of a post-war miracle belongs to mythology rather than serious history. In fact, many of the characteristics and accomplishments of post-war Japan are deeply rooted not merely in the post-war period, but more precisely in the dark valley of early Showa. And Dower describes Japan as undergoing a second industrial revolution between 1930 and 1945. During this period, it became the world's fourth largest exporter, with the third largest merchant marine. Just 27% of its industrial workforce was in heavy industry in 1927, but by 1942, that number was 68%. Many companies that grew during the war, such as Hitachi, Dentsu, Nomura Securities, and Nissan, became even more well-known after the war. By the start of the full-scale war with China in 1937, Japan was already virtually self-sufficient in machine tools, scientific instruments, and chemicals. And the Chiso Corporation, to use its later name, was one of the new Zaibatsu companies, such as Nissan, that grew to prominence in the interwar and wartime period. It became Japan's third largest manufacturer and was at the leading edge of chemical technology. It began with a factory in Minamata in 1908, followed the flag to Japan's colony of Korea, where it built a huge chemical factory and the world's second largest dam. It had operations in northern China, Taiwan, and Southeast Asia, and was Japan's largest civilian munitions manufacturer. Chiso began making a chemical called acetaldehyde at its Minamata factory in 1932, using mercury as a catalyst in a process it developed itself. Acetaldehyde was an intermediate chemical used in making plastics. This production continued until 1968. In a reminder of the close ties between the company and what was often called its castle town, what we'd call a factory town, the man who invented that process was the mayor of Minamata from 1950 to 58 and 1962 to 70. Returning to John Dower, he explains that post-war growth was not a miracle, because to be a miracle, a phenomenon must be inexplicable. But if we understand pre-1945 history, that helps us understand that post-war growth. And Chiso is an excellent example of this. I would suggest, though, that in addition to being inexplicable through science or logic, there's a second requirement for a miracle. It must be good. It must be welcome. If a person drops dead unexpectedly walking down the street with no medical explanation, we don't call that a miracle. And so Minamata's history is a reminder not only that Japan's high growth has logical explanations and isn't a miracle, but that high growth was not entirely good, that it had a dark side, a high cost. Chiso's factory in Minamata, I mentioned, had been discharging organic mercury since 1932. And on May 1st, 1956, an epidemic of what was called an unknown disease was first reported. Unknown because, of course, in 1956, Rachel Carson had published Silent Spring. We didn't understand bioaccumulation. It wasn't understood that the mercury was being concentrated in fish and shellfish and consumed by human beings and destroying their nerve and brain cells and killing many of them. But by December of that year, 17 patients had died. Yet the Ministry of Health and Welfare dissolved its research group when it concluded in 1959 that organic mercury in fish was the cause. The company put forth a series of alternative explanations, and fishing was never banned. In this first period, the victims sought compensation, both as fishers for economic losses and as patients for the suffering and death caused to them and their families by the disease. And by the end of 1959, the first of 4 so-called solutions to the Minamata disease issue was in place. The patients held a sit-in at the factory gate. The fishing cooperative petitioned, demonstrated, and took the plant manager hostage. Fishermen rioted at the factory. In response, the governor appointed a committee of local notables in time-honored fashion, and this committee mediated compensation agreements with fishing cooperatives and patients. Patients had to accept a solatium agreement under which the company made small sympathy payments without accepting responsibility for the disease. And the most infamous clause said that even if it was proven in the future that Chiso's waste caused the disease, the patients could not demand further compensation. But in fact, cat experiments by Dr. Hosokawa, who headed Chiso's hospital, had already shown the company that its acetaldehyde waste caused the disease, but this was kept secret, as was the fact that the waste treatment equipment installed at the end of 1959 did not remove mercury. So this settlement that ended the first round of responses in 1959 was a victory for the company and for government authorities who wouldn't be willing to pay the costs of high growth or make companies pay them for 10 more years. They control the methods of dispute resolution and kept the issue out of the courts and in the hands of local notables. And these actions by the victims were, on the surface, perhaps similar to peasant rebellions of the Tokugawa period, beginning with requests and petitions and escalating into violence. They gained some relief, but never challenged the established hierarchy or mobilized national support or brought their struggle directly to the central government. There were even martyrs, as in Tokugawa times. The man who climbed over the gate to let rioting fishermen in died of Minamata disease less than a month later. Yet, these patterns of action were determined not by a Confucian worldview, by which I mean benevolence expected of superiors in return for acceptance of hierarchy. It was impossible for the victims to mobilize the resources needed to proceed differently. They could not present their case to a national audience because such an audience hardly existed then. The city rallied to support the company when it was challenged by people who were already targets of discrimination. The media's so-called neutrality and willingness to believe scientists from the center over those in peripheral universities helped confuse the public about the cause. So the 1959 settlement in Minamata, the first of the four called solutions, helped clear the way for the continuation of high cost, high growth, officially enshrined in the income doubling policy declared by Prime Minister Ikeda in 1960. But, and there are the rioting factory workers. And here are the patients accepting that salation agreement. But Minamata and Japan changed between the first two rounds of responses to the disease. In Minamata, Chiso's moral and economic authority declined. The factory workforce was cut in half from 1950 to 1970. Workers who refused to join the new union created in the wake of a bitter 1962-63 strike were discriminated against by the company, and they sympathized with the patients as fellow victims. And in Japan as a whole, the biggest change, of course, was dramatic economic growth and the accompanying social change. Per capita GNP in 1956 was just over 100,000 yen. By 1971, it was over 750,000 yen. In 1958, only 15% of urban households had televisions and 5% had refrigerators. 5%. Urban. But by 1970, each of those appliances could be found in over 90% of all households in Japan. And Japan's GNP passed West Germany's to become second in the so-called free world in 1968. That year, 1968, was also, of course, the centennial of the Meiji Restoration, which raised questions about Japan's modernity and its costs among progressives who wished for a more active citizenry. Many placed their hopes in the rise of the citizens' movement after the 1960 security treaty protests by hundreds of thousands of people who'd never expressed themselves politically before that outside of the voting booth. After the protests, Prime Minister Ikeda, who had been Minister of International Trade and Industry in 1959 and urged the cabinet to contain the Minamata dispute, then instituted his famous plan to double income within a decade, hoping to turn the nation's energies in less divisive directions. But of course, the left did not disappear after 1960. Alongside the existing communist and socialist parties, two new streams developed, the New Left and the Citizens Movement. The New Left sects, however, alienated many Japanese with their radical ideology and violence. The Citizens Movement had several branches. One branch coalesced around the Vietnam War. Left-wing intellectuals formed the anti-Vietnam War group Beheiren in 1965 and established a very loose network of groups nationwide, not aligned with the established opposition parties. Another branch of the citizens movement consisted of local environmental groups. But here too there were a couple of branches. Most were preventive movements, such as in Mishima Numazu, whose members tended to be on higher rungs socially and economically than those seeking compensation for damage they'd already suffered from pollution diseases. Therefore, it was other pollution cases, especially the second Minamata disease reported along the Agano River in Niigata in 1965 that were more important for Minamata. Niigata victims lived downstream and had no ties to the factory discharging mercury, unlike the residents of Chiso's castle town. So they organized quickly, sued the company in 1967, and won their case in 1971. By 1968, all of these changes, Chiso's decline, economic growth in Japan, and social change, the rise of the citizens movement, the appearance of other pollution diseases, had undermined the 1959 settlement and suggested useful new patterns of organization and action. And it had become possible for patients and supporters to imagine bringing Minamata to center stage through a nationwide network of support. In January 1968, the first part of this network was created when activists in Minamata, along with members of the anti-management union at Chiso, established the Citizens Council for Minamata Disease Countermeasures. They hosted a visit by Niigata patients and worked to support patients in Minamata. Later that year, the government finally announced that Chiso's mercury had caused the disease. Some patients accepted government mediation, while others filed suit in June of 1969. But I think the lateness of this suit is proof not of any cultural aversion to litigation, but of the overwhelming weight of Chiso in the community and of the victims' isolation and poverty. Their support network grew after the Association to Indict Those Responsible for Minamata Disease was founded in Kumamoto, and then related groups sprang up nationwide, just as with Beheiren. And as with Beheiren, they and the Citizens Council avoided formally aligning themselves with the socialist and communist parties or the radical New Left. Outside of court, another new tactic was the single share movement, in which patients and supporters bought shares in Chiso. And here's a Chiso stock certificate owned by a supporter. And these enabled them to attend the 1970 shareholders meeting, televised nationally, where they confronted the president directly, and I mean grabbing him by his lapels. And this widely broadcast incident was one way the victims did what they could not do in 1959, take their case directly to the nation. And such pressure helped force the government to pass pollution control laws and establish the Environment Agency. Another tactic was direct negotiations with Chiso by patients who were certified after the lawsuit was filed. The balance of power in Minamata was still against them, and national public opinion was the key. So they went to Tokyo, the seat of the national government and media, where their sit-in at Chiso's headquarters lasted 20 months. Now, Chiso made some huge mistakes. Company guards attacked patients, and Eugene Smith, the American photographer who'd come to Minamata with his wife Eileen. And in response, scores of prominent intellectuals attended rallies and demonstrations and issued open letters of support for the victims. The company blocked its office doors with iron bars, making for great photo opportunities and jokes about the Chiso Zoo. This time, unlike the first round, Minamata was not an example of successful elite control of dispute resolution. These events and the work not only by Eugene and Eileen Smith, but also other photographers, filmmakers such as Tsuchimoto Noriaki, writers such as Ishimura Michiko, and thanks to the University of Michigan for republishing the great English translation of her work, Paradise in the Sea of Sorrow, all helped make Minamata into a movement. The patients who sued won their case in March 1973, and the award was the largest in Japanese legal history. Chiso agreed to a settlement in July 1973 with all certified patients, giving them ongoing compensation payments and medical care. And a total of 3,000 people have been certified. This was the second so-called solution to the Minamata disease issue. Yet, many patients remained uncertified, and the responsibility of the government was not determined. So, court cases continued. At the end of 1995, the Murayama cabinet announced a so-called final settlement of Minamata disease to compensate many of the uncertified patients, though at a much lower level. Over 11,000 received one-time compensation payments and medical care, and another 1,200 medical support alone, but only in return, in an echo of the 1959 agreement, for promising never to sue or demand certification as full official patients. So this third solution still left some patients uncompensated, and Murayama's apology was not a legal acceptance of government responsibility, and about 50 people rejected this compensation and continued their lawsuit. And in October 2004, the Supreme Court found the national and Kumamoto governments guilty of allowing the disease to spread, and also said the standards for certification of official Minamata disease patients were too strict. That left the situation confused, with many more people applying for certification, the certification committee still not doing much, the government refusing to relax the standards, and more people filing lawsuits. The government put in place from 2009 to 2012 a fourth so-called solution with two parts. First, a Minamata disease special measures law, giving one-time patients and or medical care to nearly 57,000 more people. And second, as part of this solution, Chiso was split into two companies in 2012. If you go to the Chiso website, this is what you'll find for Chiso. Chiso today does nothing but pay compensation. And this was designed because they didn't want the company to go bankrupt paying compensation and then perhaps have the government have to pay it. So it was split into Chiso and another company you're directed to from this homepage called JNC that actually carries on the regular manufacturing and business operations of Chiso. I won't say anything, but you'll be blown away by the JNC webpage. And if you can't read that, There's a close-up. Creating joy with chemistry. Joy of designing a sustainable and comfortable lifestyle. Joy of creating an earth-friendly environment. Joy of answering to ever-changing contemporary needs with technology and creativity. We will continue to create joy for people through chemistry. Over a picture of Minamata and the factory and the bay they polluted. And that's not new. When I took a tour of the Minamata factory in 1994, I wasn't allowed to take photos, but I did. And this motto is at the entrance to their exhibition room: for the benefit of society through chemistry. So with all of these solutions, a total of over 72,000 people have been granted monetary compensation and or medical care, but over 200,000, some people say up to 300,000 people have lived in areas where they likely consumed contaminated fish, and despite court orders, the government has never done a comprehensive health survey of all of them. And 8 lawsuits involving over 700 plaintiffs remain in the courts. So the Minamata issue has not disappeared. So my conclusions about the meaning of the Minamata story are several. And I'll split them into 2 parts, about democracy and about Transwar and why it hasn't gone away. It's not just a case of food poisoning, really, but one of the persistent legacies of the Transwar period and a barometer of Japan's society and democracy. And it was at the suggestion of Herbert Bix that I used the Japanese people's own terminology, Sengo Minshu Shugi, post-war democracy, and tried to ask what their actions and words suggest they think that means. Japan's activist citizens and public intellectuals, I found, define democracy in a social context. Even most activists are not usually concerned with overturning the system or entering it themselves, but instead they've measured democracy by the effects of popular concerns on public policy, by the vigor of popular political action, and by the extent to which people believe that the system can be made to treat them fairly. So in this sense, maybe I thought when I wrote my book that Minamata sheds light on a criteria gap in evaluations of Japan's post-war democracy. Americans focus more on a checklist of infrastructure, while Japanese focus on thought and behavior. We may say Japan is a democracy because it has a constitution, political parties, free elections, a free press, popular rights. In Japan, the focus, as expressed by the intellectual historian Maruyama Masao, for example, was more on the internalized patterns of thought and the actions essential for the nation to be truly democratic. And such a view was natural for people who had a democratic system and before that an imperial system imposed on them from above. It's not the system, but what you do with it that matters. But I think in the past few years, maybe this criteria gap has narrowed as we Americans realize that constitutions and laws alone do not guarantee democracy if those at the top ignore them and if enough people are willing to follow demagogues rather than work to keep democracy alive. But the Minamata incident did not shatter the tense equilibrium of the post-war Japanese polity. Yet still it helped change both the point of balance between various forces in that polity and the way in which that equilibrium was reached. Japan was not simply ruled from 1955 on by a totally unresponsive iron triangle of elites. Yes, the Liberal Democratic Party has remained in power with almost no breaks after 1973 and that first settlement, but it has been on occasion forced to employ to the utmost its talent for preemptive response and co-optation. And citizens have devised patterns of political action, such as the One Share movement, that were truly new. Unlike earlier peasant rebellions or rice riots or tenant unions, in the ways they created and mobilized coalitions and appealed to a national audience. The stress on autonomy from political parties by most of the Minamata network, though, wasn't totally new. Think back to the first political parties in the 1880s. Ever since then, few Japanese have really enthusiastically identified with them. The dominant conservative parties have been perceived as self-interested pyramids of local and regional and national bosses rather than channels through which public opinion can be turned into public policy. And left-wing parties have typically been seen as rigid hierarchies driven by ideology, unwilling to deal with local issues unless those issues can be controlled from above and used for ideological ends. And that distrust of parties helps explain not only the ease with which the parties were removed from power in the 1930s and then dissolved, but also the attraction of citizens groups 30 years later. Likewise, the co-optive responses of conservative rulers continued techniques skillfully practiced throughout Japan's modern history. Marginalized groups, when they bring their complaints to center stage, have frequently been recognized, compensated, or co-opted just enough to re-marginalize them without fully accepting their demands. This was the response to the freedom and popular rights movement in the 1880s, to the challenges to the oligarchs by the parties in the first decades of the Meiji Constitution, to tenant unions in the 1920s and 30s, and such a solution was applied to Minamata in 1973 and since. Processes for redress of grievances and for political participation in general were not significantly regularized or legitimated. The new patterns of political action and organization were costly and difficult to repeat. So Minamata, with its lack of closure, symbolizes the possibilities, but also the limits of post-war democracy. So overall, it raises important issues for our understanding of post-war democracy. Power and policy depend on more than just the relative strengths of politicians versus bureaucrats. The economic miracle is not the whole story or an accurate story of post-war Japan, and political history can only be understood in its social setting. And finally, despite the formal legal and institutional infrastructure, democracy as defined and practiced by Japanese citizens can really only be understood in its social setting and has remained quite ad hoc. It can be creative, full of tools for citizens to use, but it's always depended on continual definition and redefinition in practice. So Minamata has left a legacy not of regularized procedures and institutions for expanded pluralism, but of possibilities. So that's my take on democracy. My other question for today has been why 66 years now after its discovery, 44 years after the dumping of mercury ended, after 4 so-called solutions, Minamata isn't over. And one obvious but partial answer, which I hope was clear from my narrative, is that the government and company have never offered sufficient solutions. They've consistently limited the numbers certified or compensated and have made flawed and limited efforts to heal Minamata's society and environment. They failed in their attempts to make people believe that they've resolved the issue. Another reason, of course, is that patients and supporters have kept pressing for more comprehensive solutions, and they, along with photographers, filmmakers, and writers, have worked to keep the issue in the public eye rather than let it be swept under the rug. Minamata retains a powerful grip on public memory in Japan. Eugene and Eileen Smith's book of powerful photographs and equally powerful words about Minamata, and I've got it here, we can pass it around later, went out of print in the United States soon after its publication in 1975, but sales of the Japanese version continued, and with the release of the movie Minamata starring Johnny Depp as Gene Smith, and sadly Depp's problems are the reason the film wasn't shown widely in the US, a new edition of the book was published in Japan. And as a reminder of how that contributes to public memory, here's the trailer for the film. I think, yes.
I'm the greatest photographer that Life magazine has ever had. I'm tired, my body's older than I am, and I'm broke.
You're the single most impossible photographer that Life has ever had.
Well, say that then.
There's a company that's dumping toxic waste into the sea. People die.
The cover-up is as much of a story as the story itself.
For 15 years they knew. And they kept poisoning people. There's a resistance underground.
We are not so easy to keep quiet.
We need global attention.
With you, we have a better chance.
I'm here to help if I can, but I need you to help me.
Mr. Smith, would you like something to drink?
I'd rather wait until I get outside the building before I drop dead.
Let what is happening here play out here, where it belongs, in Minamata.
It's been made very clear to me now. I am seriously unwelcome here.
Listen to me, I need the pictures, Gene.
We're gonna do this together. Pick up your camera. Point. Focus. Click. That's how you tell your story.
See it if you haven't. It's sad it was hard to see in theaters, but there's a DVD and streaming. The rest of the world might associate Minamata with other pollution disasters, but most Japanese link it to a broader set of issues going beyond its symbolism of the dark side of high growth and the flowering of the citizens' movement. Prime Minister Murayama exemplified this when he announced in 1994 that as a socialist, there were 4 goals he particularly wanted to achieve while in office. An apology for Japan's role in the Pacific War, compensation of the Ianfu, comfort women, the sex slaves of the Japanese military, better compensation for hibakusha, victims of the atomic bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, and finally, a political settlement of the Minamata issue. Many of you have probably heard of, and some heard directly from, the kataribe, or storytellers in Hiroshima and Nagasaki, who keep memories alive by telling about their experiences of the bomb. There are such kataribe in Minamata as well. And they, like the hibakusha, say they tell their story so that once again these tragedies will not occur. So no one will again have to suffer what they had to suffer. And in the case of both the Hibakusha and the Minamata victims, a younger generation of Kataribe has appeared, sometimes children of the original Kataribe and sometimes not, who've made it their mission to keep the stories alive. Really, though, in some ways, why hasn't it gone away is not the right question. First, mercury, of course, persists in the environment. All parts of Minamata Bay, with over 25 parts per million of mercury in the sludge, were dredged, and the contaminated sludge dumped in the innermost part of the bay behind a wall of steel sheet piles and under thick plastic sheets to create reclaimed land. But the steel wall has an expected lifetime of 50 to 100 years, the plastic less, and the project was completed by 1990. Secondly, the disease itself is incurable. It does not go away, except, of course, at death. And even when no more patients survive. Did I skip one? Even when no more patients survive, as we have seen, the memories and lessons of Minamata will not go away. Finally, if we're to learn from the past, memories of Minamata should not go away, as is the case with memories of war responsibility, the Yanfu sex slaves, and Hibakusha atomic bomb victims. The historian Carol Gluck borrows from Macbeth to describe war memories as a ghost at the historical feast. In the play, you might remember, Macbeth has his friend Banquo killed to save his plan of becoming king of Scotland. And then at a feast, Macbeth, and only Macbeth, sees Banquo's ghost. And memories of Minamata are another such uncomfortable reminder of our guilt and responsibilities, and a message saying never again. Now, I'm uncomfortable having the last word. I think Minamata victims should have it. So let me show you Sakamoto Shinobu, a congenital Minamata disease victim, tireless activist. This is her 5 years ago.
Thank you very much for coming. And thank you for your speech yesterday. The message was very clear. And what this conference of the parties is doing is to send a very clear message to the world that this should not happen again.
Hello. How are you? We are so glad that you could come here to this event. Very, very important because you bring a strong message.
あなたが来てくれたことで強いメッセージを伝えてくれました。本当に重要なことで。
おなたのおなたのねあなたもに何なった大事のねあなたもやじを大なるにになったの弟だよ伝えるためになったあんなあいてなってなってだってたいの実はでかいでおじなつ何年越しになるねあなたごら終わっておいなったおらよ大人だいて出会ったおらいたらなるげじだった一緒に来て 行った。
Thanks. I'm looking forward to the discussion, which is usually the best part of these events.
Thank you so much for that presentation and, yeah, that really sombering note that you left us on there. So now we would like to open up the floor for discussions. I'd also, as we get started, would like to pass around first Professor George's book here, and then the other book that he mentioned earlier, which is this book of the photographs by Eugene Smith and Eileen Smith. So a really rare copy in English that you can all take a look at as well. So I'll start one here. You can pass this around. And then I'll give this one back to you here. Is there anyone here? We'll be switching between questions on Zoom and then those again in the room. Does anyone in the room want to start us off with a question? Great, thank you.
Thank you very much for an amazing presentation. I had a quick question about something that you mentioned right at the beginning of the talk. And you said that Chiso had factories in Korea and in other Southeast Asian countries. And I wondered if there were similar cases of Minamata Byo in those areas, or if the mercury dumping was only in the Japanese context. And if it was in other contexts, what did the government do, or how did Chiso engage with compensation for those individuals as well?
Good question, and you're not the first person to wonder about that, obviously. The person who looked into it the most was Dr. Harada Masazumi, who was a doctor at Kumamoto University Hospital, who really confirmed the existence of congenital Minamata disease and worked most closely with the patients in Minamata, and then tirelessly traveling the world, not just to tell the world about Minamata disease, but to look for more examples of mercury poisoning. So he traveled from the shores of Lake Victoria to the Amazon, where gold mining was done with, mixing gold ore and mud with mercury in 50-gallon drums and so on, and also tried to see whether there might have been mercury poisoning in places where Chiso had operations. That factory was in a city that's now in North Korea, so it's a little more difficult to know about the situation there. And I'm no expert, and he wasn't able to find out. They weren't doing quite the same thing there. Apparently they were using mercury, but that's about all I know there. It isn't clear that there was mercury poisoning from Chiso's operations outside of Japan. It is clear that there is mercury poisoning outside of Japan in many, many other cases. Not exactly like this, where there are large amounts bioaccumulated from factory effluent. The biggest problem now, and in recent decades, of course, has been emissions from coal-fired power plants, and then that mercury falling out of the air into the water. That's why we've had warnings for decades about eating too many fish caught in rivers and lakes around the United States. There have also been a few incidents of mercury poisoning from consumption of grains that were treated with pesticides, including mercury, often grains that were not intended for consumption but for planting. That happened in Iraq, that happened in New Mexico, and I'm not sure about other places. There have been tests that found high levels of mercury in whales, dolphins, seals in numbers of places too. So in places like the Faroe Islands and so on, that may have affected people who ate those. So it's not a clear answer to your question, but that's a general answer about mercury poisoning elsewhere. Yes.
Great, thank you. I have a question that came in a little bit earlier from the Zoom participants. I'll read it here for you. Professor George, thank you for your fantastic presentation. One thing that stands out is the relative importance of social movements in the face of self-interested businesses and governments. This is something we can say is a global phenomenon. You've spoken to the particularly Japanese characteristics of Japanese democracy. What of this dynamic between the victims and the powers that be can speak to the Japanese social limitations related to social mores and expectations?
So I guess the question is asking what's different about Japan, even suggesting there are particular weaknesses in Japan. I suggest that there are both strengths and weaknesses almost anywhere. I remember the first time I talked to Eileen Smith about her experience in Minamata, one thing she mentioned to me was that she went to 3 Mile Island after the nuclear accident there, several months after, when a lot of the news reports had died down, reporters had disappeared, there weren't many people around there. And she stayed there for a while, and she went around door to door talking to people, asking what was going on, and she was struck at the lack of other people doing that and the lack of local support groups springing up. And she saw that as a strength in Japan. In the case of Minamata, the other pollution diseases, in the case of other things like the 3/11 triple disaster of the earthquake and tsunami and Fukushima nuclear meltdown in 2011, local support groups specifically focused on the local problem spring up and link victims and supporters and often work with very fierce focus on the issues. And she said, we don't seem to have so much of that in the U.S. On the other hand, what we seem to have long had more of here that Japan had less of was strong, well-funded, continually existing, nationally organized groups like the Sierra Club or other groups that deal with multiple issues that don't go away after one local issue disappears, that can quickly bring effective lobbying to bear in Washington, D.C. Japan was a laggard in that sort of thing as well. Although it's catching up, Greenpeace Japan has become stronger in recent years. So I'd say there are differences, but not just weaknesses. There are strengths and weaknesses everywhere.
Thank you very much for your lecture. Thank you very much for your lecture. My question is, what about how does the idea of nature that is so embedded in Japanese culture and in their arts and so forth, how does that get influenced by this, or how does this influence the support for anti-pollution groups, or even the regular everyday, how should I say, how does it fit in this scheme of, you know, the factory owners are also Japanese. They go to the Shinto temple and so forth. How does this get resolved, this conflict?
That's a question that a lot of people have wrestled with. I'm very cautious with cultural explanations. You know, the idea that there's this Judeo-Christian separation of humans from nature, and therefore we can dominate and destroy it because we're outside of it. And then there's the Shinto animistic view of nature, with people being part of it and therefore cherishing it. I mean, look at what Japan has done to nature. But there is something, of course, that can be drawn on from that tradition in Japan. And people do that. In the wake of 3/11, for example, up in Tohoku, there have been a number of movements to bring together the mountains and the seasides, talking about the fact that people who do forestry and farming away from the ocean and people who fish in the ocean depend on each other and need each other, and they both need to care for both. And drawing on that is important. But I wouldn't push it too far. I think people make decisions for pretty rational reasons. I mean, why, for example, was the savings rate in Japan so much higher a little while ago than in the United States? Not just because Japanese are Japanese and Japanese save, but because they didn't have as good a social security system, because their pay system gave them big bonuses in June and December, so they naturally saved at least for a while, and so on. So I tend to look at more specific, rational reasons than cultural reasons for the way people behave. Thanks.
Great. Thank you. I see another question here in the room.
Mm-hmm.
Hi, thank you so much for this very fascinating talk. I was thinking about whether a framework like necropolitics might be perhaps useful to understand.
I'm sorry, I couldn't hear what you said there.
Yeah, I was wondering whether a conceptual framework like necropolitics by Achille Mbembe and so on could be helpful to understand these events, and whether the category of race or class or gender is useful to understand what kind of peoples are more vulnerable to death in Japan. And I mean, I do not know much about it, but it seems that very near Minamata there was also coal mines where many kind of minorities also worked.
Sure.
So I wonder whether, I mean, what does the position of Kyushu in particular tell us about death and so on, and the dark side of the high growth that you talked about.
Right.
Thanks.
Right. Sure. Well, I just, in passing, mentioned that one thing in Minamata was that the first and worst victims were people who already were discriminated against in a way. Yes, there's a long history of, Tokyo people in particular seeing people in Kyushu as more backward and less civilized. By the 50s and 60s, there was a view of farming and fishing as the sort of dirty, less advanced kind of life that everybody wanted to get away from. Chiso had its headquarters in Tokyo by that time. The managers and engineers tended to be people from Osaka and Tokyo. The workers tended to be local people who were looked down on. Minamata was chosen for the factory because land was cheap, labor was cheap. They moved to Korea because it had those advantages even more so. It was a colony, land was cheaper, labor was even cheaper. Hydroelectric power was even cheaper. So that factors into it, very much so. Gender is an issue as well. If you think of civic activism, it's really interesting. Margaret McKean wrote a book in the 70s about citizens groups in Japan. She found that very few of them were led by men, although the membership was at least half women. Minamata's somewhat of an exception in that case because the citizens support group had women at the top. And Ishimura Michiko, of course, the Minamata writer who played such an important role in the support group, was a woman. Eileen Smith has been very active from then until now. But I think those sorts of class and gender issues have been very important in helping understand pollution victims. And that applies not only in Japan. You know, pollution victims tend to be people who live in places that are less desirable and people who can afford to live elsewhere, earn more, and look down on the people who can't. And those are the people who tend to suffer most. Yes.
Great, yes. Just a second.
Hi, thank you for the presentation. I found the slide of JNC's current website astounding and very offensive, and I have to imagine that the division between Chiso and JNC is not fooling anyone, and I'm curious to know what the current operations of JNC are like, and if they're still using Mercury, and if they're the target of continued resistance by citizen movements.
Well, the Chiso Corporation, and I've called it Chiso throughout, even though its name has changed. In the pre-war period, it was absolutely at the cutting edge of technology. You know, what we think of as, you know, Sony and Honda and so on in the post-war period. That changed in the post-war period when it fell behind. It didn't switch to petrochemicals like the rest of the chemical industry did. It shrank quite a bit and became less and less important. They stopped using the mercury in 1968, and they're a shell of what they used to be. What they do make mostly now is time-release fertilizers and pesticides so that farmers can apply them less often, and chemicals that are used to make LCD displays. They're pretty much ignored now. They're not that important anymore. But the reason it was so important to split them into two was that the government has long feared that if they went bankrupt, there'd be a demand that the government take over paying compensation. And the government has always wanted to enforce the so-called polluter pays principle, that they don't pay, that the polluting company pays, because if the government pays, it would be a sort of implicit recognition of government responsibility. But they have found backdoor ways to actually pay. The government doesn't pay the compensation payments to victims, but they do provide the cost for health care for victims, except for those 3,000 fully certified patients. That's covered by the company. But health care for those other 69,000 is paid for by the government. Also, to keep Chiso from going bankrupt, they had an arrangement whereby the prefectural government of Kumamoto issued bonds to lend money to Chiso, and those bonds were bought by the national government with the expectation that Chiso would never pay back the loan. So the government is actually subsidizing Chiso in paying indirectly those compensation payments.
Thank you, very interesting. I'm going to take a question from Zoom over here. Jeffrey Engel says, fascinating and very dense talk. Thank you so much. I wish I was in Ann Arbor right now to shake your hand. A comment and a question. You mentioned Ishimura Michiko, and I've been recently working on and translating some of the vast bodies of poetry she wrote over the course of her life. Although few Americans are aware of her writing beyond Kogai Jodo, she wrote about environmental concerns and the need for new ways of thinking about social organization and its implications for the polity. Ishimura's poetry took on renewed energy after 3/11, and there she continues to mention Minamata as sort of a morality tale. This brings me to my question. Could you comment on the ways that writers, thinkers, and activists have drawn connections between Minamata disease and the Fukushima disaster since 2011?
I'm not sure about writers. Jeff, maybe you know more about that, the asker of the question. Certainly thinkers and activists have. I remember, Eileen Smith reacting to Fukushima, thinking, oh my God, it's Minamata all over again. This isn't going to go away for decades either. I'm going to be worrying and I'm going to be involved with this forever too. I guess maybe going back to of citizen volunteer action, very quickly responding to a disaster with people going to Kobe and helping the victims of the earthquake there. And that certainly happened a lot after 3/11. And in a sense, that may be people who think about things like Minamata and what did happen very quickly there. Partly in Minamata too, after the disease was discovered in Niigata, that forced a rethinking. Journalists, scientists, scholars, doctors, and others said, well, maybe we can get it right this time. And a lot of them hurried there. And there, for example, because they saw and warned about what was happening, they were able to prevent there being large numbers of congenital mercury poisoning victims, for example.
Great, thank you. I don't see any other immediate questions, so I'll add a question here myself. I'm really interested in sort of the coalition building that sort of took place that really got Minamata disease victims, some of the later compensations that happened. And I was wondering if you can compare a little bit in more detail some of the sort of first set of organizing that you consider more of like peasant organizing with some of the coalition buildings that took place later on that really sort of pushed what democracy was meaning at that time, but also the movement in general.
Well, I said a lot about what happened at the time. A few things I didn't mention came later that I think are quite interesting. Minamata patients groups formed links with Zainichi Korean groups, with Hibakusha groups, with Hisabetsu Burakumin groups, and also globally. There have been Minamata disease victims. You saw Sakamoto Shinobu and others who've traveled and formed groups to link Minamata with pollution victims in Southeast Asia. I traveled with a group from Minamata to Johannesburg for the UN Conference on the Environment there 20 years ago. And we met with a citizens group in Soweto that had been fighting a coal-fired power plant built in Soweto to give not them electricity, but the white folks living in downtown Johannesburg electricity. And then they brought some of them to Minamata later. So there have been some really amazing coalitions, both throughout Japan and throughout the world, that were built later, beyond the ones that I mentioned in earlier decades.
Great, thank you.
Another question, sorry. I'm curious about the intersection of Minamata disease with disability justice, and I'm curious to know if Minamata disease spurred any wider movements for disability justice across Japan.
I don't know. If it did, it wasn't immediate, that's for sure. You can see now, if you've been to Japan in recent years, you know, things that you hardly see in the United States. Go to train stations. You know, you can arrange, if you're in a wheelchair, to have a little ramp made to help you, brought to help you get on the train, and call ahead to the station where you're going to get off, and they'll have a little ramp, and all kinds of things like that. It's happened very quickly, just very recently. Not much in early years. So I'm not sure what to ascribe that to, but probably not Minamata. It's been a terrible struggle. You know, Sakamoto Shinobu, she's not really very mobile now. She's in a wheelchair most of the time, but she still gets around as much as she can. When we lived in Minamata, we lived right near her, she still could walk pretty vigorously. You know, we'd see her out walking all the time. But as the patients age, that changes. In Minamata, those accommodations came sooner because they had to, and people in Minamata got accustomed to dealing with people in wheelchairs, people in wheelchairs who drove with the necessary accommodations much earlier than people in other parts of Japan. But I don't think it spread because of Minamata, just because that happened only in very recent years. Someone should do a study of why that happened, but I don't know why.
Great, thank you. I see a question in the back.
So I'm not a political scientist, and I'm not even a modern Japan historian, but when I think about this in the broader social context, which I thought you did such a great job of talking about, the fascinating thing, again, you touched on this, the divide between the sort of stereotype of the locked-in elites at the top, and then these citizens groups that really have, they have a remarkable impact. And I wonder if you can make any more connections. I'm thinking of things like in the 1970s, the food protests, sunshine, noise, that are totally locally driven. And I guess other kinds of activism, which isn't quite the same that you see in Hiroshima and Nagasaki on the days of the A-bomb anniversaries, when the Nagasaki mayor gets up and makes a very forthright speech about the problem of nuclear weapons and so forth. All of this is so interesting to me because it gives you a lot more complex picture of Japanese society. You get the stereotypes of the nails that stick up getting hammered back down, and goodness knows the Minamata protesters got hammered down plenty of times. But these citizen groups are just there and persistent, and I wonder if you can draw some more threads amongst those different things.
Yeah, Bill, you said something really important when you talked about local action and citizens groups. And that's one reason, you know, despite Minamata fading from the news for most Japanese after 1973 for a long time, and you know, the others of the Big Four and so on, I don't think civic activism disappeared at all. In fact, I think it became more widespread, but often much more locally based without such visible national networks and without being on the national news so much, and also much more run by, not just participated in by women. A good example is food safety. And organizations, like the Seikyo Co-op. There's a lot of that all over Japan from the 70s, mid-70s on. And you're right to point to that. Maybe, Hiroshima and Nagasaki are different cases, but those don't go away. People see them at least once a year. But I do really think that the photogenic sort of TV news kind of pollution activism may have faded after the early 70s, but that activism really moved and spread down to the grassroots and became something that people saw everywhere, and more people participated in.
Question in the front.
Thank you for a very fascinating talk. You ended your talk with one of the victims sort of talking to these people in positions of power, the UN, and I'm curious how that kind of activist labor and sort of connecting with global, connecting this very localized issue to the global, impacted or continues to impact policies around Minamata, whether it's compensation or in other ways, and is it actually fruitful other than just sort of the publicity of putting it out into the world?
Good question. I guess one thing along those lines is the Minamata Convention on Mercury, a global treaty that took effect. I think I've got that on the handout. Did I put it on there? I think 2013. That is intended to limit and control global use of mercury. And a lot of it was hammered out in negotiations in Minamata. And that was a chance for really interesting back and forth between the Japanese government, which wanted to present itself as having overcome the challenges of pollution and present Minamata as a success story. And Minamata patients and supporters wanting not to let them off the hook, but wanting to make sure the world understood that Minamata was an ongoing problem and that these things are never fully, completely solved and require constant vigilance and don't really fully go away. And they were able, I think, to get the government to go a little further than they otherwise would have, because they insisted that they would protest the attachment of the name Minamata to the treaty if it didn't go further than it originally would have. So it came out to be a pretty decent treaty overall. So there was some good impact there, and a chance, I think, because all these international delegates were in Minamata, to make the world more aware of Minamata.
Great, thank you. So we're about at time, so unless there's one last final pressing question, maybe we'll wrap it up here. All right, well, thank you again for a good discussion with the audience here, and then again, that fascinating lecture. It was really a pleasure to have you here at the University of Michigan, and hopefully everyone in the audience will see you again next week at our last lecture for the year. Thank you.
Thank you.